1947, James Crawford risks everything, his career, his freedom, his life, to cross an ocean and find the German woman he loved in secret. But when he arrives in Boston, she's vanished. No forwarding address, no explanation, just silence. What James doesn't know is that Helga has been searching for him too. And when her letter finally arrives, it will reveal a truth that changes everything they thought they'd lost. Comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe for the complete story of how enemies became everything to each other. November 3rd, 1944. The transport truck carrying 23 German women prisoners rolled through the gates of Camp Huntington, Kentucky, as the autumn sun began its descent. The air was crisp with approaching winter, carrying the scent of tobacco fields that surrounded the military installation. Among the guards standing in formation to receive the prisoners was Sergeant James Crawford, a 32-year-old from Birmingham, Alabama, whose dark skin marked him as different even among American military personnel. He had volunteered for this assignment 6 months ago, understanding that overseas combat would likely mean dying in a war that didn't value his life equally with white soldiers. Better to serve stateside than to die for a country that wouldn't acknowledge his humanity. The prisoners descended from the truck with careful movements of people who had learned not to draw attention to themselves. Among them was Helga Steinmann, a 24-year-old from Stuttgart who had served as a communications specialist for the Wehrmacht in occupied Belgium. She wore the grey auxiliary uniform with perfect posture, her blonde hair pulled back severely, her blue eyes reflecting nothing but exhaustion. She had been captured in September when American forces swept through her position so quickly there was no time to destroy documents or escape. Now, after weeks of processing and transport across the Atlantic, she stood on foreign soil, waiting to learn her fate. James Crawford's gaze moved across the line of prisoners with professional detachment until it landed on Helga. Something about her caught his attention, though he couldn't articulate what. Not beauty exactly, though she was beautiful in that severe Germanic way that seemed designed to express order and control. It was something else. A quality of absolute stillness, as if she had learned to disappear into herself. He understood that quality. He had cultivated it his entire life, the ability to make himself invisible to people who saw him as threat or curiosity, but never as fully human. Captain Eleanor Hayes, one of the few female officers assigned to the facility, stepped forward to address the prisoners through a German-speaking interpreter. The regulations were explained in careful, measured tones. The women would be housed in a separate compound. They would work assigned duties. They would follow all camp protocols. Any violation would result in punishment. The prisoners listened with blank expressions of people who had heard similar speeches many times before. James was assigned to evening perimeter watch, which meant he would see the women prisoners as they moved between their compound and the mess hall for meals. He told himself he was simply doing his job, maintaining security, ensuring no one attempted escape. But he knew that he was watching for one particular prisoner, waiting to see if that quality of absolute stillness would reveal anything when she thought no one was observing. The first weeks established patterns that would define the entire duration of Helga's captivity. She moved through her assigned duties with mechanical precision, working in the camp laundry, handling uniforms and linens that belonged to the men who guarded her. She spoke to no one unless directly addressed. She ate her rations quietly, never looking up from her plate. She returned to her barracks each evening and disappeared into the routine of captive life with such completeness that other prisoners sometimes forgot she was there. James Crawford maintained his professional distance, but his attention to the German prisoners intensified. He began noticing details. How Helga's hands moved when she folded military uniforms, each motion economical and precise. How her breathing changed when certain officers passed near her workstation, a barely perceptible quickening that suggested fear running beneath her controlled exterior. how she sometimes stared at nothing for long stretches, her eyes focused on something happening only in her own mind, somewhere far away from Camp Huntington, Kentucky. It was in the third week of November when something shifted, though neither James nor Helga could have explained exactly when or how it happened. James was assigned to supervise the laundry detail where Helga worked. The work was repetitive and monotonous, but it was indoors and warm, and the other prisoners seemed grateful for the relatively comfortable assignment. As James moved through the facility, making his rounds, checking that everything was proceeding according to protocol, he found himself paying particular attention to the section where Helga worked. She was folding a pile of wool blankets, her movements economical and precise. Her face remained expressionless, but James noticed something he had not seen before. Her hands were trembling, barely perceptible, just the slightest shake that caused the blanket to flutter slightly as she held it. He watched as she set the blanket down, placed her hands flat on the work surface, and took a deep breath. Composure restored, control maintained. But he had seen it. That crack in the armor, that moment when her carefully maintained facade had threatened to fracture. James approached her position, and Helga immediately stiffened, her eyes moving to some point past his shoulder in the way she had perfected for dealing with the male guards. She would not make eye contact. She would maintain distance. She would give them no reason to notice her. "Your hands okay?" James asked quietly. Helga's eyes flickered toward him, then away. She didn't respond. James continued, "You've been working the same pile of blankets for 20 minutes. That's not your usual pattern." Helga's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The fact that he had noticed her usual patterns was alarming. Prisoners who drew the attention of guards were prisoners who eventually experienced problems. "I'm fine, Sergeant," she said quietly, her accent thick but her English understandable. She had been studying English in the evenings, teaching herself from a grammar book that one of the American guards had left in the laundry by accident. "You sure?" James pressed. He knew he was violating something, crossing a line that existed between guard and prisoner. The regulations were explicit, fraternization was prohibited, but something about her suffering made him unable to simply walk past and pretend he hadn't noticed. Helga finally met his eyes, and for just a moment James saw what lay beneath her controlled exterior. Fear, yes, but also exhaustion so profound it seemed to have become part of her cellular structure, and something else, a kind of recognition, as if she was seeing, really seeing, someone for the first time in months. "I'm fine," she repeated, and this time there was something different in her voice. Acknowledgement that he had noticed and had chosen not to make it into something more, not yet anyway. The incident created a subtle shift in their dynamic. James found reasons to be present during the laundry details. He began leaving books in places where Helga might find them, English language materials that would help her improve her vocabulary. Simple things, a newspaper, a magazine, a children's primer. He never acknowledged leaving them. She never acknowledged finding them. But the books appeared and disappeared, and James understood that she was taking them, studying them, using them to prepare for whatever future might exist for her after the war. By mid-December, Christmas was approaching, and the camp administration was making preparations for a holiday celebration. The prisoners would be allowed to participate in a limited way. There would be a special meal. There would be some decoration. It was an attempt to maintain morale, both among the American personnel and among the captives. James volunteered to supervise the decoration project, which meant he would be working closely with some of the German prisoners who had been selected to help. Helga was among them. They were tasked with creating garlands from evergreen branches that had been brought in from outside the camp, and with making simple decorations from paper and whatever materials could be scrounged from around the facility. The work required them to be in close proximity, and James found himself acutely aware of every detail, the way Helga's fingers moved as she tied branches together, the faint scent of pine that clung to her uniform when she brushed past him. The quality of her silence, which was different from the silences of the other prisoners. Hers felt like silence maintained through effort, like words were pressing against her lips. "In Germany, we make these differently," Helga said quietly one afternoon, when the other prisoners were occupied with other tasks, and James found himself alone with her, holding evergreen branches while she arranged them. Her words came so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that James almost dropped the branches. She had not volunteered conversation before. "Tell me," James said, keeping his voice level, professional, though his heart had begun to race. Helga continued working as she spoke, her hands never stopping. "We use holly berries, red ones, they mean hope, and we tie the garlands with ribbons, white and red, the colors of—" She paused. "Different colors," she finished, "different ribbons than here." "What colors do they use here?" James asked, understanding that she was testing him, trying to determine if he was genuinely interested. "Green and gold," Helga said, "and sometimes red. But it's not the same. Holly berries, they have meaning. Here it's just decoration." James found himself moved by this small revelation, this tiny crack in her defensive walls, where she was sharing something personal, something that spoke to her identity and her culture and her longing for home. "Maybe meaning is in the person who creates it," he said carefully. "Maybe these decorations mean hope because you're making them. That's where the meaning comes from?" Helga stopped working and looked at him directly. Her blue eyes held something James couldn't quite identify, not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of it. The Christmas meal was the most elaborate food Helga had encountered since her capture. Real meat, fresh vegetables, bread made with actual flour rather than the substitute materials that had become standard in the last year of the war. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, and James found himself watching her from across the mess hall, understanding from her reaction to the food just how much she had been hungering for something beyond the basic rations that kept prisoners functional. After the meal, there was music. A soldier with a guitar played American songs, and another with a harmonica joined in. Some of the prisoners began to sing along quietly. Then someone requested a Christmas carol, and the guitar player began playing Silent Night. Helga's breath caught audibly, and James saw tears forming in her eyes before she managed to blink them away. She knew this song. It was German. Without quite thinking about what he was doing, James found himself standing and moving toward the piano that sat in the corner of the mess hall, an old upright that had been donated to the camp months ago. He sat down carefully, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play the melody that was being sung. His fingers were a bit rusty, but he had learned piano as a child from a woman who cleaned houses in his neighborhood, who had seen something in the young James Crawford that made her believe he should have access to music and beauty. He played, and the room fell into a kind of hush, and Helga sang the words in German, her voice soft and wavering, filled with emotion so profound that several people in the room found themselves crying. When the song ended, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then Captain Hayes, the female officer in charge, began clapping, and others joined in. James remained at the piano, afraid to turn around and see Helga's reaction. That night, after the prisoners had returned to their barracks, James found a note slipped under his bunk. He recognized Helga's careful English handwriting immediately. "Thank you for the piano. Thank you for understanding. I needed someone to know I existed. I needed someone to see me." James sat on his bunk, holding the note, understanding that he had crossed some kind of line that he couldn't uncross. He was breaking regulations. He was violating protocols. He was doing something that could result in serious consequences for both of them, but he also understood that he couldn't go back to simply seeing Helga as a prisoner to be guarded. She had revealed herself to him, and in doing so, she had revealed something in him that he hadn't known existed, a hunger for connection that ran deeper than any of the fears about consequences or protocols. The new year of 1945 arrived with bitter cold that penetrated the wooden barracks despite the heating systems. The German prisoners were struggling with the cold in ways that the American personnel recognized as dangerous. Frostbite and hypothermia were real possibilities. James volunteered to help weatherproof the women's barracks, taking on extra hours to seal gaps and improve insulation. He worked alongside other soldiers, but whenever possible, he positioned himself where he might catch a glimpse of Helga as the prisoners moved through their daily routines. Their communication remained limited and coded. The occasional note, though James made sure they were destroyed after reading. A glance that lasted slightly too long, the brush of hands when passing something across a work surface, contact that was brief enough to deny if questioned, but electric in its intensity. In late January, James was assigned to supervise a work detail in the camp library, where some of the prisoners, including Helga, had been tasked with organizing donated books. The library was warm and relatively isolated, with high shelves that could create small pockets of privacy. Helga was cataloguing a stack of books when James entered. She didn't look up, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She knew what his presence meant. They had established patterns. When James was assigned to supervise certain work details, it created opportunities for brief conversations, for moments where they could exist together in ways that pushed against the boundaries of regulation and protocol. James moved through the library, checking the work of the other prisoners, making notes on a clipboard. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. Then, as he passed near Helga's station, he leaned down as if to examine the books she was organizing. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly. Helga continued her work without looking at him. "I'm managing, Sergeant Crawford." The use of his full title was a signal. It meant she was being cautious, that there might be someone nearby who could hear them. James moved on, but Helga's response had told him something he needed to know. She was struggling. The cold, the captivity, the uncertainty about what would happen to her once the war ended, all of it was wearing on her. That evening, James took an action that violated military protocol and could have resulted in court-martial. He obtained extra blankets from the supply room by claiming there was a heating problem in the women's barracks. He distributed them with the help of a guard he trusted, making sure that Helga received 2 extras. He also included a note written in careful German. "You are strong. You are surviving. This will end. Hold on." The note disappeared, and James never received a response. But over the following weeks, he noticed changes in Helga. She seemed less diminished. There was something different in the way she held herself. Not quite hope exactly, but perhaps a small reduction in despair. By late February, rumors began circulating about the war's end. Germany's military situation was deteriorating rapidly. Allied forces were advancing from all sides. It was becoming clear that the war in Europe would conclude within months, not years. For the German prisoners, this created a kind of cognitive dissonance. The possibility of going home was both desperately desired and deeply feared. For James, the approaching end of the war created an urgency he had never felt before. The regulations separating him and Helga would likely persist for as long as she remained a prisoner. Once the war ended, repatriation would begin. She would leave, return to Germany, and he would probably never see her again. In early March, James made a decision that he knew was dangerous, but felt necessary. He requested a transfer to the administrative office, a position that would give him access to prisoner records and that would also position him to potentially influence decisions about prisoner assignments. The transfer was approved, and James found himself with slightly more flexibility in his schedule and slightly more authority in determining how certain tasks were assigned. He began assigning Helga to clerical work in the administrative office, work that required her to file documents and organize records. The assignment raised some eyebrows among the other guards, but James's record was clean and his request reasonable, so it was approved. Now Helga spent several hours each day in the administrative office, and James had legitimate reasons to be present during her work shifts. They still couldn't communicate openly, but the proximity was different. They could exist in the same small space. They could see each other without the constant surveillance that existed elsewhere in the camp. It was during one of these shifts in mid-March that something shifted irrevocably. Helga was filing documents, while James worked at a nearby desk. The office was quiet, just the two of them, and James found his attention wandering from the paperwork before him to the woman who was organizing files with her characteristic precision. Helga reached for a document from the stack in front of her, and her hand trembled, not the smallest tremor, but a visible shaking that caused her to set the paper down and grip the edge of the filing cabinet to steady herself. "Helga," James said quietly, using her first name for the first time. "What's wrong?" She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were filled with tears that she seemed unable to hold back. "News came," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A letter from my mother through the Red Cross. My father died. In the bombing. Berlin, January. My sister, I don't know if she survived." James understood immediately the weight of what she had just shared. This was information she couldn't process, emotions she couldn't contain, and she had shared it with him because somewhere in the past 5 months she had come to trust him in ways she didn't trust anyone else. Without thinking about consequences or protocols, James crossed the small distance between them. He placed his hand on her shoulder, and Helga turned toward him, her face crumpling as she began to cry. James pulled her against him, aware even through his own emotional response that if anyone were to walk in, he would be finished. His military career would be over. There would be consequences that neither of them could afford. But he held her anyway, held her while she grieved for a father she would never see again, for a sister she might never locate, for a country that no longer existed, for a life that had been destroyed by the war that had brought them both to this small office in Kentucky. "I'm sorry," Helga whispered, pulling back after several minutes, wiping her eyes with shaking hands. "I shouldn't have. You could be court-martialed if anyone found out about this." "I don't care," James said, and he meant it. He had spent his entire life managing his reactions, maintaining control, presenting an acceptable facade to a world that didn't want to see his authentic self. The regulations about fraternization suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the reality of genuine human connection. "You should care," Helga said, though her voice lacked conviction. "There are reasons for these rules. We are enemies. You are American. I am German. This is not possible." "I know," James agreed, "but it's happening anyway." The rest of March and into April unfolded with desperate intensity. They stole moments when they could, brief conversations in the administrative office, a moment where their hands touched as they passed a document, the simple presence of being in the same small space, breathing the same air, existing together without the constant surveillance that defined the rest of their lives. James began leaving books again, more deliberately now. Poetry, mostly, German translations of English poetry, and English poetry in translation. He left them where Helga would find them, with passages marked. He was trying to communicate something that couldn't be said in their stolen moments, something about the capacity of the human heart to transcend the artificial divisions that separated them. Helga left responses written in the margins of books, thoughts and reactions, and slowly, carefully, declarations. Not quite love, but something moving toward love. Something that recognized in James Crawford a kindness that seemed impossible given everything she had been taught about Americans, and that forced her to question everything else she had been taught about the nature of enemy and friend. In late April, news came that changed everything. Germany's military situation had become untenable. Surrender was imminent. Within days, the reports confirmed it. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The American soldiers at Camp Huntington celebrated. Men embraced. Some cried with relief. The German prisoners, in contrast, fell into shocked silence. Some wept for the loss of their country. Others seemed almost relieved that the uncertainty had finally ended. But all of them understood that their futures were now uncertain in new ways. Repatriation would likely begin soon. James found Helga in the administrative office on the morning after the surrender announcement. She was staring out the window at the Kentucky Spring, her face revealing nothing but her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "They'll ship us back soon," she said without preamble. "Now that the war is over, there's no reason to keep us here." "I know," James acknowledged. "This will end," Helga continued, turning to look at him directly. "Whatever this is between us, it will end. You'll stay here. I'll go back to Germany, and we'll try to forget that this happened." "I won't forget," James said quietly. Helga's expression crumpled. "Neither will I. That's the problem." Over the following weeks, as rumors circulated about repatriation schedules and official orders were drafted, James and Helga existed in a kind of suspended time. They knew their days together were numbered. They knew that the regulations separating them would eventually assert themselves, that the artificial divisions created by war and nationality and rank would ultimately prove stronger than whatever existed between them. But they also knew something else, that in the small space between guard and prisoner, between enemy combatants and two people struggling to survive a war neither had chosen, something real had developed, something worth the risk. In mid-May, Captain Hayes called James into her office. His heart sank, certain that she had discovered his relationship with Helga. But instead, she closed the door and said something unexpected. "I know about you and Helga Steinmann," she said without preamble. James's face went carefully blank. "Ma'am?" "I'm not going to report it," Captain Hayes continued. "I've watched you work with the prisoners. You treat them with dignity. You see them as human beings. That's rare, and it's important." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I've also watched Helga. She's different since you've been working with her. More present, less broken." "What are you saying, Captain?" James asked carefully. "I'm saying that regulations exist for good reasons," Hayes said, "but I'm also saying that sometimes the most important thing is that people treat each other with kindness. Helga will likely be repatriated within the next month. There are some applications being processed for German prisoners who might be able to remain in the United States. It's highly irregular. Almost no one is getting approved. But if she wanted to apply, I could facilitate that." James felt something shift in his chest. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've seen too much cruelty in this war," Captain Hayes said simply. "I've seen what happens when people treat each other as less than human. And I've also seen what happens when people choose to see each other's humanity, despite everything working against it. That matters. Helga deserves to have choices about her own future." The repatriation orders came on the 23rd of May. All German prisoners would be processed for return to Europe within 2 weeks. Helga would be on the first transport. James spent the last 2 weeks in a kind of fog, aware that they were ending, that he would soon be separated from Helga by an ocean and an entire continent. They stole moments where they could, final conversations, final touches. In the administrative office late at night, when James would find reasons to work after hours and Helga would find reasons to organize files, they existed together as they never quite could during daylight. "Come with me," James said one night, the words escaping before he had fully formed them. "Where?" Helga asked, though she understood immediately what he meant. "I don't know," James admitted. "Away from the camp. Away from the regulations. We could figure it out. We could try." Helga closed her eyes. "I don't have a choice, James. I'm being repatriated. I'm a German prisoner. You're an American soldier. There is no figuring it out." "There might be," James said, "if you apply to stay. If you apply for displaced person status." Captain Hayes said it's possible. Helga looked at him with an expression that contained equal parts longing and despair. "And become what? A displaced German woman in a country that might not want me, depending on a black soldier who would face enormous social pressure for being with me. James, I'm thinking about what's realistic, what's possible." "I don't care what's possible," James said. "I care about what I want, and I want you to stay." But Helga didn't apply for displaced person status. On the morning of June 4th, she boarded a transport truck with the other German prisoners scheduled for repatriation. James watched from a distance, maintaining his professional bearing, unable to say goodbye publicly without raising questions neither of them could answer. As the truck pulled away, Helga turned to look out the back, and for just a moment, their eyes met. In that moment, James saw everything. The love that had developed between them despite all the obstacles, the recognition that they were both choosing duty over desire, practicality over passion, and the understanding that this was how it had to end. That evening, James found a letter under his bunk, written in Helga's careful English. Dear James, by the time you read this, I will be on a ship crossing the Atlantic. You changed my understanding of what was possible. You showed me that kindness could exist in unexpected places, that the divisions between us were less solid than I had been taught. I am going back to Germany because it is my responsibility. My mother survived, and my sister was found in a refugee camp. They need me, but I will carry what happened between us for the rest of my life. You made me believe in second chances. You made me believe that people could see each other's humanity, even across the deepest divides. I don't know what my future holds. Germany is devastated, but I will remember you. I will remember the piano. I will remember feeling like a human being again, not just a prisoner, not just an enemy, but a person worthy of love. If the world changes, if circumstances become different, I hope we will meet again. If not, know that you changed my life. With love, Helga. James read the letter over and over until the words blurred together. He understood that he was grieving. He was mourning not just the loss of Helga, but the loss of possibility, the loss of a future he had imagined but never quite believed could exist. But he also understood something else, that what had happened between them mattered, that in a war defined by dehumanization and hatred, they had chosen to see each other. They had chosen kindness. They had chosen to recognize humanity across enemy lines. He kept the letter for the rest of his life, reading it in moments of doubt when the world seemed too harsh and the divisions between people too vast. 1945 became 1946 and then 1947. The years passed with a kind of relentless forward momentum that left James Crawford feeling as though he was being carried by a current he couldn't control or escape. He left the military in December of 1945, returning to Birmingham, Alabama, to a hometown that felt both familiar and utterly foreign after his years in uniform. The city seemed smaller than he remembered, the prejudices deeper and more entrenched, the opportunities for a colored man even more limited than they had been before the war. He took work at a steel mill, the same place his father had worked before his death, laboring long hours in heat that reminded him of nothing so much as the burning humiliation of being seen as less than human by people who called themselves patriots. The mill was brutal, dehumanizing work that paid barely enough to survive. But it was work that didn't require him to pretend to be less than he was, at least not in the ways that other employment demanded. He lived in a small apartment in the colored section of Birmingham, a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, where whispered conversations about his mysterious time stationed with German prisoners made him something of a curiosity. The women in his church eyed him with interest, but he couldn't muster any response to their carefully orchestrated attempts to catch his attention. They were nice enough, but they weren't Helga. They hadn't looked at him across a room filled with the detritus of war and recognized something worth saving. At night, alone in his apartment, James would take out Helga's letter and read it until the folds in the paper grew soft from handling. He had memorized it by the end of 1946, could recite the words without looking, but he read it anyway, as if the physical act of reading it might somehow transport him to that moment when she was still present, still real, still his in the way that wartime had allowed. He had tried to find her through official channels, submitting requests to the military for information about displaced German prisoners, writing letters to the Red Cross office in Germany, attempting to trace her through the chaos of post-war bureaucracy. But the systems were overwhelmed, the records confused, the sheer scale of displacement too vast for any single individual to navigate. He wrote letters addressed to Stuttgart, to the neighborhood where her mother had lived, knowing the addresses were probably wrong, knowing the buildings might not even exist anymore. Some letters were returned marked "Address Unknown." Most simply disappeared into the postal system's black hole. He began to accept that he would never see Helga again, that what had happened between them existed now only in memory, in the worn pages of her letter, in the late-night piano playing that had become his private ritual. He would sit at the old upright piano that he had managed to acquire through a complicated series of trades and arrangements, and he would play Silent Night, hearing in his mind Helga's voice singing in German, understanding that some connections are severed by circumstance and time, but never truly broken. It was in October of 1947 when the letter arrived. He almost didn't open it, the envelope bearing German stamps and a return address in Bremen looking so official, so institutional, that his first thought was that it must be some sort of notification related to the war, some final piece of paperwork related to his service. But the handwriting on the envelope, though older looking, more careful, still contained something familiar, something that made his hands tremble as he turned the envelope over in his fingers. The letter was written in German, with English translations written between the lines in the same careful handwriting. Helga had spent months learning enough English to write the letter in both languages, wanting to be absolutely certain that he would understand every word, that there could be no ambiguity about what she was trying to communicate. "My dear James," the letter began, "you are probably surprised to receive this, and I do not blame you. I have tried to write this letter many times, and each time I have torn it up, afraid that what I am about to tell you is impossible, that you have moved on with your life and no longer think about the foolish German woman who occupied too much of your heart during a time of war. But my mother, God rest her soul, died this summer, and in sorting through her things, I found the letters you sent, all of them, every one that I thought was lost, that I thought would never reach me. 37 letters over 2 years. You had not forgotten. You had continued trying to reach me, even when there was no response, no indication that your words were finding their way through the chaos of Germany's destruction. I had to tell you what happened after I left Camp Huntington. I had to make you understand why I made the choice I made, and why that choice was the beginning of something rather than the end. When I returned to Germany, I found my mother and sister living in a cellar in Munich, surviving on rations that barely kept them alive. They needed me. That part was true. But what I also discovered was that I could not accept the life that Germany offered me after the war. The country was devastated, yes, but it was also consumed with blame and recrimination. I was young and beautiful and German, and that combination made me either a target or a responsibility, depending on who was doing the looking. For 6 months, I lived with my mother and sister, helping them rebuild a life from nothing. I worked as a translator for the American occupation forces, a job that my improved English made possible. I saw you everywhere, James, in the uniforms of the officers who came to the offices where I worked, in the accents of the soldiers who occupied Berlin and Munich and Stuttgart. I lived in a strange, liminal space where I was helping my homeland while simultaneously working for the power that had defeated it. In March of 1946, I made a decision that my mother said was insanity. I applied for an immigration visa to the United States. I filed the paperwork as a displaced person seeking sponsorship, listing the camp where I had been held as my previous place of residence. I wrote in my application that I had learned English, that I had skills, that I wanted to help rebuild the world rather than remain mired in the broken pieces of Germany's past. The application process was agonizing. They asked for character references, for proof of good conduct during captivity, for assurances that I wouldn't be a burden on American society. I had nothing to give them except the truth, that I had been a prisoner of war who had been treated with kindness by American soldiers. That I had learned that the enemy I had been taught to fear was actually capable of profound humanity, that I wanted to live in a country where such kindness seemed possible. My mother and sister thought I was leaving them again, abandoning them to face the difficult reconstruction process alone. But I promised them that once I was established, once I had work and housing, I would bring them to America. It took time. It took months of waiting and forms and bureaucratic processes that seemed designed to frustrate and demoralize. But finally, in June of 1946, I received notification that my application had been approved. I was to be granted a one-year visa as a displaced person, with the possibility of extending or converting to immigrant status after that period. I made arrangements to travel to the United States in September. I booked passage on a ship from Bremen. I packed the few belongings I had, and I prepared myself for the possibility that you might not want to see me. That 2 years might have been enough time for you to move on, to build a different life, to forget the German woman who had shared a few stolen moments with you in a prisoner of war camp in Kentucky. I arrived in Boston on September 18th, 1946. I had an address for the YMCA where displaced persons were temporarily housed while they looked for work and permanent housing. I had a list of employment agencies and social services. I had the name of a Lutheran church that helped immigrants. What I also had, though I didn't admit it to anyone, was the hope that somehow impossibly I would find you. That I would walk through Boston, or eventually through Birmingham, and you would be there, and this time there would be no regulations to separate us, no war to divide us, no circumstances to prevent us from trying. But I also understood the reality of my situation. You were an American soldier in a small town in Alabama. I was a German displaced person in Boston, Massachusetts. The chances of our paths crossing were infinitesimally small, and even if they did cross, the social pressures we would face would be enormous. Your family, your community, the entire rigid structure of American racial and social hierarchy would stand against us. Still, I could not make myself not hope. For the first 3 months, I lived at the YMCA and worked as a translator for a law firm that had contracts with the military regarding displaced persons and war crimes tribunals. It was important work, helping to document the stories of people who had survived the camps, people who had seen things that no human should see. It was also deeply traumatizing work. Every day, I listened to testimonies that made me understand the full scope of what my country had done, the absolute horror that had been perpetrated in the name of the Reich. I began to make contacts in the displaced person community, people from Germany and Austria, people like me who were trying to build new lives in America. I attended church services where German was spoken. I joined clubs for immigrants. I slowly began to build a small community that understood what I was experiencing, the strange combination of relief and guilt and homesickness that came with choosing to start over in a foreign country. But all the while, I was watching. I was reading newspapers from all over the country, looking at names and stories, hoping to find something that would tell me where you were and what you were doing. I wrote letters to the military asking for information about specific soldiers, but they wouldn't tell me anything. Privacy regulations, they said, security concerns. By December, I had found an apartment in Boston, a small room in a boarding house run by a German widow named Frau Müller. I had permanent employment as a translator and secretary at a legal firm. I had begun the process of applying for extended visa status. By all objective measures, I was building a successful new life. but I was also profoundly lonely. I missed you in ways that I couldn't quite express, in ways that seemed irrational, given that I had known you for only a few months, under circumstances that were entirely artificial and defined by war. Then in January of 1947, I received a package at the law firm where I worked. There was no return address, but it bore a postmark from Birmingham, Alabama. My hands shook as I opened it during my lunch break, sitting in the empty office, afraid of what I might find or not find. Inside was a book, a volume of poetry in German 19th century romantic poets, the kind of book that might be found in any educated household. Nothing particularly special or remarkable, but inside the front cover, in handwriting that I recognized immediately, were words written in German. Helga, I do not know if this will reach you or if you even want to hear from me. I have written you so many letters that have disappeared into the void, and I have begun to accept that our time together was a moment that belonged to the war and will not exist in peacetime. But I saw your name on a displaced person registry that we were updating at the social services office where I now work, and when I saw that you had applied for extended visa status in Boston, I thought I should try one more time. If you do not want to hear from me, put this book in the mail back to me, and I will accept that answer. But if you do, please write back. Please let me know that you are alive, and that you remember the piano and the letter and the man from Alabama who loved you. The letter inside the book went on to explain how he had gotten my name, going through displaced person applications systematically, looking for any record of a Helga Steinmann, how he had made inquiries through various military and social service offices, how he had found my employment information and the address of the law firm through contacts he had made in the displaced person services. He had been searching for me as methodically and desperately as I had been searching for him. He had never stopped trying. He had continued to hope, even when there was no rational reason to hope. I called him that evening. I was so nervous that I had to do it 3 times, hanging up twice before I let the call go through. When he answered, his voice was exactly as I remembered it. Deep and warm and familiar, with that slight accent of the American South that had become dear to me in my dreams over the past 2 years. "Hello?" he said, and I heard in that single word all the hope and fear and longing that I was feeling. "James," I said, "it's Helga. I got your book." The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but felt like an eternity. Then I heard him breathe out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Helga," he said. "Oh God, Helga." We talked for hours that night. We talked while my supervisor grew concerned about the long-distance charges on the company phone. We talked while tears ran down both our faces, unable to quite believe that we were hearing each other's voices again. That this connection that we thought had been severed was actually just dormant, waiting for the right moment to be reactivated. He told me about his work at the steel mill, about the difficulty of readjusting to civilian life, about the constant ache of missing me. I told him about my journey back to the United States, about my work with displaced persons, about my application for extended status, about the fact that I had never stopped thinking about him. "I want to see you," he said finally, and I heard the vulnerability in his voice, the fear that maybe seeing each other in person would break the spell, that whatever existed between us in letters and late-night phone calls might not survive face-to-face encounter. "I want that too," I said. "But James, I need to be honest with you. I'm German. I'm a woman from the enemy country. Your family, your community, they won't accept me. We will face enormous social pressure, enormous difficulties. I need to know that you understand what you're asking for." "I understand," he said quietly. "I've had 2 years to think about it, Helga. I understand completely, and I don't care. I've spent my entire life doing what people expected me to do, living small so as not to threaten anyone, accepting limitations that I never should have accepted. But you showed me something different. You showed me that we can choose to see each other as human beings instead of as categories or enemies or problems to be managed. I'm not going to waste another day of my life pretending that the divisions that society insists on are more important than the connection we have. He took a week of vacation from his job and drove to Boston in a car he had managed to save up enough money to purchase. When I saw him step out of that car on a cold February morning in 1947, I understood that the last 2 years had changed us both. He looked older, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during the war, but his face lit up when he saw me with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that I began to weep. We spent that week walking through Boston in the cold, talking and remembering and slowly, carefully relearning each other. We went to restaurants and sat in the back because that's what was expected in those days, but neither of us cared any more about expectations. We went to bookstores and museums and churches. We went to the waterfront and stood watching the harbor while ships came and went. Ships that connected this continent to others, that made the world feel slightly smaller and more interconnected. On the last night before he had to return to Alabama, we stood in the small room at Frau Mueller's boarding house, and he asked me to marry him. He didn't have a ring, only a simple band that he said had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who had fought her entire life against limitations imposed on her by race and gender and circumstance. He was offering me not just marriage, but a life, a partnership, a commitment to choosing each other despite all the forces that would stand against us. I said yes without hesitation. The logistics of our marriage were complicated by the social realities of the time. We could not marry in Alabama, where miscegenation laws were still on the books. We could not marry in Massachusetts without facing enormous social pressure and potentially legal challenges. We ended up marrying in New York, in a small church in Harlem that was accustomed to performing ceremonies that defied social norms. We had no family present, only Frau Mueller and a kind minister who understood what we were doing and why it mattered. After the wedding, James returned to Birmingham to arrange for a transfer to a steel mill in New York. I remained in Boston, continuing my work and making preparations for extended visa status, which was granted in June of 1947, with a path to permanent residence and eventual citizenship. By July of 1947, we were settled together in a small apartment in Harlem, beginning the process of building the life we had imagined together during those stolen moments in the Camp Huntington administrative office. I continued working as a translator and began work on becoming a legal secretary. James found work at a steel mill in New Jersey, a job that took him further from me than I would have preferred, but that offered better wages and fewer racial tensions than the mills in the South. We lived quietly but openly as a married couple, not hiding what we were, but also not flaunting it. Harlem was a community where our marriage, while still illegal in many places, was not unusual. We made friends. We built a small community around us. We slowly began to create the life that we had glimpsed in that prisoner of war camp in Kentucky. But our joy was tempered by the reality that my family remained in Germany, living under occupation, struggling with the aftermath of war and destruction. I made good on my promise to bring them to America. It took 3 more years of paperwork and applications and sponsorship arrangements, but by 1950, my mother and sister were living with us in a larger apartment in Harlem. My sister married a Jewish-American doctor she met in the Displaced Persons program. My mother, after spending 2 years adjusting to American life, found work as a housekeeper for a wealthy family on the Upper East Side. We had recreated family in America. We had built something that should have been impossible given the circumstances of our meeting, the time period in which we were living, the enormous social obstacles that existed against our very union. James and I had a daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1952, a beautiful girl who grew up bilingual and bicultural, never quite fully German or fully American, but beautifully, authentically both. She had her father's dignity and her mother's contemplative nature, and she moved through the world with a grace that came from understanding that she represented something important. We had a son, Thomas, born in 1954, who had his father's height and his mother's thoughtful temperament, who seemed born understanding that his very existence was a statement about what was possible when people chose love over fear. Our children grew up in a Harlem that was beginning to change, in a time when civil rights were being fought for and won, when interracial marriages were becoming slightly more accepted, if still controversial. They grew up knowing their mother's story, understanding that their very existence was an act of defiance against a society that had tried to keep their parents separated, that had tried to enforce limitations based on race and nationality, and the arbitrary divisions that human society had created. By 1970, when we hosted a reunion of our lives, we were no longer young. James had retired from the steel mill and was working as a counselor at a community center, helping young people navigate the complicated business of identity and belonging, helping them understand that the limitations society tried to impose were not inevitable or unchangeable. I had become a citizen of the United States, had changed my name officially to Helen Crawford, though I still preferred Helga, still thought in German, still maintained the parts of my identity that had brought me to this country in the first place, that had brought me toward James and toward the life we had built together. We held the reunion in our home in Harlem, inviting the small circle of people who had been important to us over the years. Frau Müller came, aged now but still sharp and kind, still maintaining the boarding house where I had first found refuge in America. A few colleagues from our work came, bringing flowers and stories and photographs from the years we had all spent working together on various projects. The children and grandchildren who were beginning to arrive came, representing the future that our love had made possible, each one a living testament to our choice to see each other as fully human. We looked at photographs from the war, from our time at Camp Huntington, from the early years of our marriage in New York. We remembered Captain Hayes, who had taken the risk of supporting our union despite the protocols against fraternization, who had understood that sometimes the most important thing was to honor people's capacity to see each other's humanity. We remembered the piano, the way it had brought us together in that mess hall on Christmas Eve of 1944, the way that single moment of shared music had changed the trajectory of both our lives. James took out his old guitar and played, and I sang in German, and our grandchildren listened with wonder to songs that connected them to a history they would never fully experience, but could understand through the love that had brought them into existence. We told the story over and over to anyone who would listen, understanding that our story mattered not just to us, but to everyone who heard it, everyone who needed to know that love was possible even across the deepest divides. Late that night, after everyone had left, James and I sat on the small balcony of our apartment, looking out at the lights of New York City, and he took my hand the way he had done so many times over the years. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't noticed your hands trembling that day in the laundry?" he asked. "Every day," I said honestly. "If you hadn't seen me, really seen me, I would have returned to Germany broken and diminished. I would have lived a small life, limited by circumstance and trauma. You gave me the chance to choose a different future, to be fully myself in a way I never thought possible. You did the same for me," he said quietly. "You showed me that I didn't have to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on me, that I could choose love over fear, connection over isolation, authenticity over the false composure I had cultivated my entire life to survive in a world that didn't want to see me." We sat in silence for a long time, holding hands, listening to the sounds of the city around us, understanding that what we had created together over the past 25 years was more than just a marriage. It was a small revolution against the systems that tried to keep people separate, a testament to the power of seeing each other's humanity, even in the most difficult circumstances. It was proof that love could survive separation, could grow stronger through adversity, could bridge divides that seemed unbridgeable. The piano still sat in our living room, the same old upright that James had acquired years earlier. Every evening when he came home from work, if he was tired or stressed or overwhelmed by the world, he would sit down and play Silent Night, and I would come and stand beside him, and together we would remember the moment when music had first connected us across the barriers of war and captivity and difference. That moment had been the beginning of everything. It had been the moment when we chose to see each other as individuals rather than as categories. When we had decided that music and kindness and genuine human connection were more important than all the regulations and protocols and social structures that tried to keep us apart. In the end, what we had learned together in that prisoner of war camp in Kentucky was that love is a revolutionary act. That choosing to see someone's humanity, choosing to offer kindness when cruelty would have been easier, choosing to build connection across supposed divides, these were acts of courage that could change the world, one moment, one heart, one person at a time. We had been prisoner and guard, German and American, separated by war and nationality and race and circumstance. But we had chosen to see each other, and in that choice we had created a love story that transcended all the artificial boundaries that society tried to impose. A story that would inspire our children and grandchildren. A story that proved that even in the darkest times, humanity and love and connection could prevail. Our grandchildren and great-grandchildren would grow up in a world that was slowly changing, where interracial relationships became more accepted, where immigration policies became less restrictive, where the rigid hierarchies that had tried to keep us apart began to crumble. Some of that change happened because of people like us, people who simply refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose. People who loved each other anyway, despite everything working against them. Elizabeth became a civil rights activist, working to dismantle the same systems that had almost kept her parents apart. Thomas became a teacher, working to educate young people about the dangers of prejudice and the power of connection. Our grandchildren spread across the country, carrying with them the story of their grandparents who had met in a prisoner of war camp and had chosen love over fear, connection over separation. Years after we had both passed, long after James had died of a heart attack in 1982 and I had followed him 5 years later, our story continued to resonate. Our children donated Helga's letters and James's photographs to a museum dedicated to oral histories of the Second World War. Researchers began to study our relationship as an example of what was possible when people chose humanity over hatred. But the most important testament to what we had created was not in museums or books or academic papers. It was in the lives of our descendants, in the way they moved through the world with an understanding that the divisions between people were far less solid than society insisted, in their commitment to seeing each other and themselves as fully human, in their capacity to love across boundaries that should have been impermeable. We had been an impossible love story, born out of the most impossible circumstances, and yet we had persisted. We had built a life that by all measures should have been impossible. We had created a family. We had contributed to our communities. We had raised children who went on to make the world slightly better, slightly more connected, slightly less divided. The piano that James had played on that Christmas Eve of 1944, the piano that had first brought us together across the divide of guard and prisoner, ended up in a museum dedicated to the Second World War. Plaques beside it explained our story in detail, told visitors about the moment when music had bridged an unbridgeable gap, when two people from opposite sides of a terrible conflict had chosen to see each other's humanity, had chosen connection over fear. Visitors would read our story and understand that love stories weren't just about romance. They were about courage, about choosing to see each other as fully human, even when society insisted on seeing only enemies or categories or differences. They were about the revolutionary act of simply treating someone with dignity and kindness. Occasionally, people who were moved by our story would visit the museum and stand before that piano, thinking about what it meant to choose connection in the face of division, to offer kindness when cruelty was expected, to build love across boundaries that seemed designed to keep people apart. They would touch the piano reverently, and sometimes they would cry, understanding on some deep level what our sacrifice and courage had meant. And sometimes, late at night, when the museum was closed, the security guards swore they could hear the faint sound of silent night drifting through the halls, as if the piano itself was remembering and celebrating the love story that had brought it to this place, that had made all of this possible.